I mean, I give a lecture on it, but I'm not.
Undoubtedly, others will continue to join us through the morning, but that's fine. Applebaum, those of you who were here yesterday, had a chance to hear me speak. I'm a professor of psychiatry here at Columbia, and I'm going to be moderating this morning's panel, which has the overall title of Right and Wrong. We'll have some speakers talking about right. I think others are going to talk about wrong. But we have a very interesting group of speakers this morning. We're going to be hearing from a variety of religious traditions or secular perspectives as well. And the first of our speakers, and I should say, when all three of our speakers are done, we're not going to take questions after each speaker, but we'll then bring them all up here as we did yesterday. We'll have the whole panel open to you for your questions and comments, and we'll have a full half hour for that. The first of our speakers this morning is David Krantz. David is professor of psychology and statistics here at Columbia and co-director of the Center for Research on Environmental Decisions. He's a graduate of Yale who received his PhD in psychology from the University of Pennsylvania and subsequently taught at the University of Michigan laboratories, and since 1985 has been here at Columbia. Among the roles he's played here have been chair of the Department of Statistics and professor in charge of education at the Earth Institute at Columbia. His initial research interests were centered on the foundations of measurement, color perception, and psychophysics, and later he focused primarily on statistical reasoning and on protective and environmental decision-making. And his teaching has focused on the same range of topics. He's also been part of the leadership for the Frontiers of Science new core course here at Columbia. He's been a Guggenheim Fellow and a Fellow of the Institute for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford. And this morning he's going to be talking about freedom perceived and freedom analyzed. David Krantz.
Thank you. Thank you. How do you start the slideshow, Eleni?
I think if we take this over here.
Oh, okay.
There we go.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here this morning, and it was a pleasure and interesting experience to hear the speakers yesterday afternoon. I hope most of you shared that experience. Partly in response to that experience yesterday and in response to my placement under right and wrong in the program today, I'm going to make a few unscripted remarks about the relationship of psychology to knowledge of free will. I'd like to avoid misunderstanding, I'd like to preface those remarks. Can everybody hear me all right? I'd like to preface those remarks by saying that I have worked in a lot of different areas of science, and I have come to view natural science as a gigantic tapestry that includes particle physics, condensed matter physics, but also includes psychology and sociology, and obviously many other topics. And I think even though the tapestry changes, it changes somewhat from condensed matter physics to particle physics, and it looks drastically different when you come over to sociology. It's a seamless tapestry. And if you try to set up any boundary and say this belongs to that group of people, you're essentially making a tear in a very interesting part of the tapestry and perhaps ruining it, or at least spoiling your chances to understand some part. I don't really believe in boundaries or in trying to define myself as a psychologist and somebody else as something else. Nonetheless, I noted that, and I agreed with Paul Gailey's remarks yesterday about the need for a variety of disciplines and a variety of points of view about free will. I noted that psychology wasn't among the topics that he included. And that seems a little odd, because a case can be made that psychology ought to be one of the lead disciplines in thinking about free will. Now, I admit it's a little hard to make that case as a practical matter because psychologists, including myself, have been uncomfortable with the concept of free will. We're uncomfortable in part because the concept raises a specter of a kind of dualism, mind-body dualism, which is deeply embedded in English and many other languages, and deeply embedded in the way people think about biology and behavior, and which most psychologists, including me, find a very unfortunate perspective. And things that remind us of that perspective make us uncomfortable. Nonetheless, I'm going to start by talking about perception, which is a psychological topic. And I'm going to argue that our evidence for free will, the reason that we talk about free will at all, comes from perception and needs to be analyzed in the same way that we analyze perception of color, perception of size, perception of beauty. These are all topics within psychology, and the perception of free will is subject to similar analysis. And free will is also obviously connected with choice in a way that I'm going to try to make clearer as I talk about perception. And choice is another major topic in psychology. In my career, I've gone from research on perception, largely color vision, to research on reasoning, to research on choice, largely the role of social goals and norms in choice. To analyze free will behaviorally is to analyze the perception of one's own free will and the attribution of free will to others. Certainly, the question of moral responsibility in connection with free will is closely connected to perception. One views moral responsibility for an action to be diminished in oneself or others when one perceives that action as other than freely chosen. Disagreements about moral responsibility can, in part, be disagreements about perception of free will, engendered sometimes by differences in the evidence that gives rise to such perception. My analysis of perceived free will leads me to deny that there is any sharp opposition between free will and determinism. Indeed, people perceive themselves to exercise free choice even or especially in situations where their actual choices are highly predictable to themselves and others. Perceived free will is associated with the perception of choice options, even when the option chosen is strongly determined by a person's goals and sense of self. This leads in turn to a closer examination of the concept of choice options. My recent work on choice theory emphasizes plans as the basic unit of decision making. Plans and the Structure of Behavior is the title of a book that's famous in psychology that was published almost 50 years ago. I'm going to use the title here, but not really too much from the book. But I'm going to assert that perceived free will is equivalent to the perception, however fleeting, of alternative plans. Now, what does this have to do with neuroscience and the question of whether neuroscience can explain free will? I think it has a lot to do with the potential agenda for neuroscience, because neuroscience right now does not give us a very good account of plans. And therefore, it doesn't give us an account of the perception of a choice between plans or of alternative plans. And I think these things, and also an understanding of random choice, are important topics to be tackled and might lead to new directions in neuroscience. And that's the outline of the talk, and I'll conclude it with a summary. I'm going to begin discussing perception with a negative example. Suppose we perceive a salient external event as the principal or even the sole cause of an action. Suppose that a loud noise at a person's left produces a strong orienting response. The person moves eyes, head to the left. Not only that person, but any observer who hears the noise and sees the orienting response is likely to perceive the response as externally driven. The leftward turn is not perceived as an exercise of free will. Correspondingly, neither the person herself nor an observer is likely to criticize the leftward turn as highly blameworthy, assuming some negative consequence ensues. One might be tempted to generalize from this example by saying that we perceive freedom as the opposite of external situational control, but this generalization creates two difficulties. First, one might suppose that there is always situational control, and the only question is whether this control is exercised by a single salient event or by events that are hidden or too numerous to grasp. If there is external situational control, are we to say that the perception of freedom is just an illusion? The second difficulty is that the effect of a so-called salient event is not intrinsic to the event itself, rather it depends on a person's experience with past similar events. Again, the orienting response provides an example. Repeated exposure to the same or very similar loud noises produces habituation of the orienting response, which gradually weakens and may disappear. One can place two people in the same immediate situation, person A habituated to the noise, B not. One would observe two quite different responses to the noise. An external observer who did not know about A's habituation might wonder whether B's leftward turn could in fact have been freely chosen rather than externally driven, since the noise did not produce any response in A. In this situation, however, person B would perceive herself as not free and not responsible for her leftward turn, while person A, who heard the noise and did not react, might recognize that she had the choice to turn left and might thus perceive herself as having chosen freely not to do so. Apart from habituation, which is a learning process simple enough to be observed even in planarian worms, people have much more complex learning processes, and they filter events through complex perceptual and cognitive mechanisms that depend on their entire developmental histories. Thus, a person's full history or some sufficient summary thereof must be included in any account of situational control of action. From the standpoint of perception, however, these difficulties can be resolved by noting that people often perceive themselves and others as highly predictable, yet nonetheless free. In the preceding example, person A, who is habituated to a loud noise, might well know in advance that she would not react to it. And likewise, others who knew her history and habits might predict the same with near certainty. Because her non-reaction is a product of learning, it is part of who she is, she perceives herself as free in that situation. She can choose to turn toward the loud noise or not, and since she has no purpose in turning, she does not turn. Let's consider briefly a much less trivial example, a person who faces a strong sexual temptation and either resists it because of who she is or seizes the sexual opportunity, again because of who she is. Her behavior may be highly predictable, both to herself and to others, yet both she and others perceive the choice as free. In short, for perception, free choice and determinism are not sharp opposites. A person perceives herself as free even when the action she takes is strongly controlled by the situation and by her past history of learning, provided that she is aware of an alternative plan that could have been selected. Her chosen action is perceived as determined by her goals and self-concept, yet nonetheless freely chosen. The sense of conforming to one's goals and self-concept can be an essential part of the perception of free will. Consider one more example, which leads me toward plans. A person reaches up to catch a ball. She perceives her attempt to catch the ball as freely chosen. But the action of reaching up may be an automatic consequence of the plan to catch the ball, rather than a separate choice. Certainly, her detailed muscle movements in reaching up, triceps, biceps, and deltoid, are part of a movement plan, and they are not separate free choices. That's why I emphasize that the perception of free will arises from a choice among plans. For example, to catch or not to catch the ball, or perhaps a very rapid choice between reaching up or jumping up. But whatever actions occur automatically within a chosen plan are not perceived as separate occurrences of free will. Only the choice of the plan is perceived as free. This also applies to moral responsibility. If I am trying to put something onto a high shelf and reach up and drop it and injure somebody, all sorts of bad things may ensue, but I won't be accused of assault. The injury that I caused with a hard, heavy object was caused pursuant not to a plan to injure, but pursuant to a plan to put something up on a high shelf. I may have been irresponsible or careless in the plan, and I could be accused of that, but I can't be accused of assault. So plans are at the core. So this discussion of plans draws on a recent paper that I published with Howard Kunruther in the 2007 Judgment and Decision Making, which emphasizes plans as the basic unit of decision making. This choice of unit is central to the argument. Prior theories of choice have treated the concept of choice option superficially, equating the concepts of strategy, action, and plan. We distinguish between game theoretic strategies, which specify a choice at every possible node in an extended decision tree, versus plans which can demand additional choices among subordinate plans at various points. And we also distinguish plans from actions. For example, in the game of chess, human players do not even have one reasonable strategy because they can't conceive of the decision tree and grasp it as a whole and plot out a strategy. But good chess players often consider alternative plans, recognizing that in carrying out a plan, they are likely to be confronted with further choices of subplans at various junctures. When it comes to actions, We distinguish between selecting a plan versus executing an action pursuant to carrying out a plan. I've already used the example of catching a ball where muscle contractions are not plans. In chess, you might think that every move you have a choice, so the distinction between plan and action disappears, but this is superficial. Some moves are very much under the control of a larger plan. The commentaries of David Bronstein, famous chess writer, tell us a lot about people's plans. For example, in discussing the famous Averbach-Kotov game from the 1953 Zurich Candidates Tournament, Bronstein comments that Averbach's fatal choice to open the G file cannot be called an error because it was made as part of a plan previously selected. There was an extraordinarily subtle oversight in his plan, but given his plan, the choice of move was just a matter of adjusting the timing. It's like walking across ice that one is confident is firm and solid. The step that plunges one into icy water is made pursuant to the plan. Perhaps only the detailed timing and length of each step is adjusted in response to surface irregularities, but such adjustments are part of the execution of a plan by a skilled walker. Not every step is a choice point. So I'm claiming here that free will derives from the awareness of having selected a plan out of two or more available. It does not matter that the selection of a particular plan is highly predictable to the person or to other observers. Only the perceived availability of alternatives matters. Of course, this means that observers may disagree in particular cases because the availability of alternatives may be uncertain, and different individuals may have different information about the case. A broad class of interesting disagreements arises in connection with apparent failures to choose obvious alternatives in problematic interpersonal relationships. Why, for example, do people remain in relationships where they are subjected to severe verbal or physical abuse? Why do women risk disease and pregnancy via unsafe sex with male partners? Some actions that appear to involve choice and would indeed involve selection among alternative plans by people in similar situations but with different background experiences are actually taken under the control of a previously selected plan without awareness of any alternative plan. Understanding that the victims perceive no choice point leads one to blame them less, if at all, for the negative consequences that ensue. So what does this have to do with neuroscience? If neuroscience is to explain the perception of one's own free will and the attribution of free will to others, it is necessary, perhaps also sufficient, to explain the brain mechanisms underlying consideration of alternative plans. It is natural, then, to ask what sorts of neural mechanisms underlie plans. There is a widespread impression, fueled by advances in brain imaging, that neuroscience has made great progress in recent years. Thinking about the neural correlates of plans should serve as a wet blanket for those who believe that science is well launched toward understanding the brain. From a behavioral standpoint, not a neuroscience standpoint, simple motor plans are ubiquitous and centrally important. Locomotor plans have long been studied. Swimming by jellyfish, planarian worms, octopi and eels, the gaits of quadruped mammals, and of human infants and adults, specialized human locomotion in athletics and dance. Great psychologist Lashley, back in 1951, emphasized the importance of a hierarchical planning structure for skilled movement, for example, in musical performance. Broca's area in the human brain seems to be essential for organizing the plans underlying fluent speech. Communication about motor plans is difficult. The coaching of dance or various forms of athletic performance is a specialized skill. There is also a vast literature on plans underlying human speech. Apart from the analysis of speech, there are many demonstrations of the ubiquity and importance of hierarchically organized motor plans in human performance. Leaders in the field include Stephen Keel, Richard Ivory, David Rosenbaum, and Saul Sternberg. Rosenbaum and his collaborators have demonstrated that even very simple actions are influenced by larger movement plans. To show more clearly the kind of evidence that exists for motor programs, I will briefly describe some findings by Sternberg. Sternberg and his collaborators examined the rapid production of short sequences of both speech and typewriting. In a representative experiment, the subject was asked to repeat a short, easily remembered sequence of words as quickly as possible following a signal. The length of such sequences varied between 1 and 5 words. The basic finding was that both the latency after the signal to start speaking the words and the onset delay between successive words spoken in the sequence increased linearly with the sequence length, approximately 15 thousandths of a second per additional item in the sequence. Exactly the same results with the same increments per additional item for both initial latency and inter-item delay were found when skilled typists were asked to type short sequences of letters as quickly as possible after a signal. The authors interpreted these results as indicating that motor programs of different lengths are assembled in preparation for speaking or typing. The retrieval of the next needed subprogram takes place by means of a serial scan of the main program, and therefore there's a time increment for each extra subprogram that must be scanned. Considerable converging evidence was amassed by Sternberg and his collaborators in support of this interpretation in a series of beautiful papers. What is the neuronal counterpart in the human brain for an assembled motor program manifest in behavior? Modern brain research asks where, but I believe the research needs to focus on what rather than where. If we do not know what, how do we know how many different places may be involved in the where question? Brain imaging lends itself to learning where, but the answers from that method may be irrelevant to behavior in the absence of a theory that states what. Can neuroscience explain free will? This seems to me to be the wrong question just now. We should ask instead whether perceptual and behavioral phenomena related to free will, such as the perception of alternative plans, could provide useful starting points to learn more about the brain. Perhaps this is possible. I believe the question of where has been overemphasized in brain research to the point where it severely impedes progress. There is place differentiation, and much has been learned about it. But as a consequence of this emphasis, we have no good models of the emergent brain processes that correspond to activation of motor programs, much less the processes involved in mixed cognitive, perceptual motor plans. From the standpoint of decision mechanisms, motor plans are just a beginning. Plans assembled by chess players might or might not be quite different in character. I've emphasized motor plans because they are ubiquitous among animals and seem a good starting point for the understanding of brain processes involved in plans, and thus also for the understanding of brain processes involved in recognizing and selecting among alternative plans. In the interest of getting back on schedule, I'm going to shorten this next section greatly. Suffice it to say that sometimes people not only seem to choose freely, but they seem to choose randomly. The places where this occurs are most often in competitive situations, in playing paper, scissors, rock against an opponent. You withhold your decision as to what you'll choose, paper, scissors, or rock till the last moment. Similarly, if you're in a shootout in soccer against a goalie, you have choices of shooting high or low, left or right, and the decision you may not even know your own decision until you find yourself making it as the shooter. Christian Schade and I have examined random behavior in the game paper, scissors, and rock quite carefully and find that people are surprisingly able to generate sequences that look random from the point of view of statistical tests, and that they do this primarily when they're offered the chance to do this by using a randomizing mechanism, an explicit randomizing mechanism. They mostly do not use the mechanism. They'll use the mechanism quite happily in situations where there is no real competition, but when they get into competition, they prefer to use their own internal randomization. So what is this internal random generation mechanism? I don't think we have any idea what it is. The mechanism is unknown, seems inaccessible to introspection. Within the field of mathematical psychology, there's long been a focus on choice probability as a theoretical variable that is affected by situational factors and by learning that it in turn generates observed choices. It is historically interesting that the first such mathematical model was formulated by Thurstone in 1927, contemporaneous with the probabilistic interpretation of quantum mechanics, which I do not believe he could have known about. A good many models of choice probability postulate specific internal stochastic processes underlying the probabilities. A broad class of such models consists of random walks with absorbing states corresponding to different choice options. There are many mathematical discussions of this topic, including those by Link, by Luce, and by Busemeyer and Townsend. Whether any of the stochastic processes discussed in the literature represent internal mechanisms that are accessible to voluntary utilization for random choice is unknown to me. Most of these are formulated using neural mechanisms as metaphors and therefore might represent starting points for neuroscience modeling. So to summarize, I believe the experience of free will corresponds to the perception that alternative plans are available. It occurs even when selection of one of the plans is predictable or determined. The challenge for neuroscience is to understand the neural correlates for plans. This may require sharp departure from place-oriented thinking. Ability to choose randomly might also stimulate thinking in neuroscience. Thank you.
Professor of Jewish philosophy at the Jewish Theological Seminary just a few blocks from here. Professor Mittleman is the author of 3 books, including Between Kant and Kabbalah, The Politics of Torah, and The Scepter Shall Not Depart from Judah. And he is also editor of Jewish Polity in American Civil Society, and Jews in the American Public Square, and Religion as a Public Good. Prior to coming to JTS, Professor Mittleman served as professor of religion at Muhlenberg College, and from 2000 to 2004, he was director of a major research project, Jews and the American Public Square, which was initiated by the Pew Charitable Trusts. Last year, he served as visiting professor of religion at Princeton, and he's now back at JTS, and his topic for this morning's presentation is rabbinic perspectives on the free will determinism problem. Professor Mittleman.
Good morning. I guess I'm charged with speaking about right and wrong, so I'll start with wrong. I found a quote in Paradise Lost, which seemed to me to be particularly apt. Milton is describing what the fallen angels do in hell. And he says, "Others apart sat on a hill retired, in thoughts more elevate, and reasoned high of providence, foreknowledge, will, and fate, fixed fate, free will, foreknowledge absolute, and found no end in wandering mazes lost." So this is a hopeless task right off the bat. But my task is to talk about how the free will, or as I prefer to say in the Jewish context, free choice determinism problem is framed within the biblical literature, within the rabbinic world, and within the philosopher rabbis of the Middle Ages. The problem of free choice and determinism is as daunting as it is ancient. The late philosopher Robert Nozick writes that the problem is so intractable, so resistant to illuminating solution, that no approach to it turns out to be fully satisfactory. The determinist case seems ineluctable. Once one admits the universality of causation, it is hard to arrest the slide from universal causation to universal necessity. That is, not only does everything have a cause, but the cause determines the effect. If exactly the same causes were present at another time, the same effects would be produced. Furthermore, this cause and effects nexus is governed by a law, such that if one were to have knowledge of all of the relevant conditions and of the law, one would be able to predict what would happen. Such a view first surfaces among the Stoics. Everything that happens has a cause, and given cause X, effect Y necessarily had to happen as it did. The cumulative condition of the universe at any instance constitutes the cause and the determinant of its condition in the next instance, nor could that new condition be otherwise than it is, given its antecedent condition. There are, of course, many technical arguments against the ineluctability of this progression. There are many ways of calling a halt to the slide toward determinism. One early approach was that of the Alexandrian Jewish philosopher Philo, who held that God gave humans the gift of free will, the exercise of which amounted to a miracle, similar to God's own miraculous overcoming of the causal laws of nature. Causality does determine natural events, but both divine miracle and human freedom, a gift of God, suspend causality. Philo's name was lost to Jewish memory, but solutions such as his reoccur, and we'll consider some of them in the Jewish context below. The problem of determinism arises within the context of ancient physics and metaphysics, but it likely would not have been felt as a problem were it not for its moral entanglements. The most compelling reason to doubt universal necessity is the desire to preserve human agency. It is not only that we want to preserve the deployment of praise and blame on which reward and punishment rest, we want to preserve human agency per se. If humans are simply instruments of forces beyond their control, then their dignity, not only their culpability, is fatally compromised. In arguing against determinism, thinkers have sought to secure the uniqueness and value of the human. The anti-determinist enterprise is axiological from the get-go. If it were simply a matter of adequate physical description and explanation, we would probably incline toward some version of determinism, at least for systems above the quantum level. But as it is minimally a matter of an adequate description and explanation of the human, we cannot quite succumb to the appeal of determinism. Even the Stoics were forced to deny the most stringent consequences of their position. The clever critique of Stoic necessity found in the lazy argument compelled the Stoics to nuance their account of cause such that some causes entailed a dimension of human agency more than others. On the Stoic view, fate set the basic framework of the causal network within which humans exist. Human assent to fate, however, co-determines what occurs. Human assent is an auxiliary cause in their jargon. Human assent is not compelled by outward circumstances, but comes about through its own nature. In this sense, universal necessity operates on two levels: the level of external antecedent causes and the level of internal self-generated causes. But precisely why the internal expression of necessity is any more compatible with a coherent account of human agency than a purely external causality is not resolved. The Stoics had to confront the problem of free choice, but could not, given the inexorable logic of their determinism, resolve it. The moral interest, the affirmation of the unique value of the human, is arguably the constant in the many iterations of the problem of free choice and determinism across cultures and ages. The metaphysical environment, or we could say the scientific environment of the problem, is the variable. For the Stoics and their ancient philosophical critics, the problem was constructed in terms of concepts of causality as well as logical necessity. Aristotle first raises the logical problem in one of his books on logic when he analyzes whether statements about the future, famously about whether a sea battle will take place tomorrow, can be truth functional. But it is Augustine, following Philo, who shifts the problem into a theological register. Universal necessity becomes personified, so to speak, in divine omniscience. Given an all-knowing God, how can God's knowledge of future events not necessitate the occurrence of those events? How can human free choice be reconciled with divine foreknowledge or providence? That theological construction of the metaphysics becomes typical of how Jewish thinkers, following Muslim precedent, framed the problem. So in this paper, I want to trace briefly some of the main options for framing and addressing the problem of free choice and determinism in Jewish thought. I'll begin with the problem as it appears in the Bible, and then I'll look at its refraction through a rabbinic lens. I'll then examine three medieval Jewish thinkers, Saadia Gaon, Moses Maimonides, and Bachya ibn Pekuda, who represent somewhat different approaches to the problem. Saadia represents an indeterminist or libertarian approach. Maimonides, at least in the esoteric strata of his work, has been held to represent a soft determinism. And Ibn Pekuda represents a view strikingly anticipatory of Kant. Both determinism and indeterminism hold within their own frameworks. The degree to which the biblical authors were aware of the problem is questionable. At crucial points, the Bible assumes freedom of choice as criterion for moral accountability. Deuteronomy affirms, "See, I set before you this day life and prosperity, death and adversity. I call heaven and earth to witness against you this day. I have put before you life and death, blessing and curse. Choose life, if you and your offspring would live, by loving the Lord your God, heeding his commands, and holding fast to them." Deuteronomy chapter 30. On the other hand, the Bible envisions a sovereign God who can rightly be thought to control everything. In Psalm 127, we read, "Unless the Lord builds the house, its builders labor on it in vain. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the watchman keeps vigil in vain. In vain do you rise early and stay up late, you who toil for the bread you eat. He provides as much for his loved ones while they sleep." Or in the formulation of 1 Samuel chapter 2, "The Lord deals death and gives life, casts down to Sheol and raises up. The Lord makes poor and makes rich. He casts down, he also lifts high." These texts surely do not exclude human agency in any consistent theoretical sense. Nonetheless, they limit the dimensions of a potential problem. The locus classicus for the problem in the Bible is the narrative in Exodus in which God hardens Pharaoh's heart. When God commissions Moses to go before Pharaoh and demand that he release Israel from bondage, God announces, quote, "I will harden Pharaoh's heart, that I may multiply my signs and marvels in the land of Egypt. When Pharaoh does not heed you, I will lay my hand upon Egypt and deliver my ranks, my people the Israelites, from the land of Egypt with extraordinary chastisements, and the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord," end quote. The abstract issue that so exercised Augustine and the medieval theologians, God's foreknowledge of events, is still inchoate here. The dilemma is more immediately moral than metaphysical. God appears to deny Pharaoh freedom of choice. Even if he wanted to repent, he would not be able to do so. He would not have in philosophical jargon, liberty of indifference. That is, he would not be able to choose among possible options. He would be constrained to choose only one: refusal to let Israel go. Does this not count against God's justice? Furthermore, God intends to use Pharaoh, as Kant might put it, as a means rather than an end. God will make a display of Pharaoh so that the Egyptians will know who is really in charge. God has not only removed Pharaoh's freedom of choice, he has made Pharaoh an unwilling tool of divine pedagogy. The text seems innocent of the moral complications it engenders, as if the loss of Pharaoh's moral agency were not an issue. Or perhaps not. As Jewish exegetes, medieval and modern, have noticed, the motif of heart hardening is artfully arranged, and the arrangement is no doubt significant. It occurs precisely 20 times. Pharaoh hardens his own heart 10 times, and God hardens it, or announces he will harden it, another 10. Crucially, God's hardening of Pharaoh's heart does not begin until the 6th plague. For the first 5 plagues, my teacher Nachum Sarna writes, the Pharaoh's obduracy is a product of his own volition. Even after the first instance where God directly stiffens Pharaoh's heart, we read that once again Pharaoh is responsible for hardening his own heart. Only afterwards does his agency decline. Shall we infer from this scheme that the biblical author acknowledged the moral problem and implied a solution to it? It is certainly possible. That, at any rate, is how the rabbis read the story. Only when Pharaoh, through his own malfeasance, proved incapable of moral behavior, did God choose to curtail his choices. The die was already cast, and Pharaoh had cast it. Thus, in the formulation of a midrash cited by the medieval exegete Nachmanides, quote, "For I have hardened his heart," Exodus 10:1. Rabbi Yochanan said, "This provides a pretext for the heretics to say that God did not allow Pharaoh to repent." Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish said, "The mouths of the heretics be closed. Only at scoffers does he scoff," a quotation from the book of Proverbs. When he warns one on 3 occasions, and that one does not turn from his ways, God closes the door of repentance on him in order to punish him for his sin. Such was the case with the wicked Pharaoh. So, on the view of the Midrash, as amplified by Nachmanides, the hardening of Pharaoh's heart is a justly deserved punishment. Rather than raising a question about the justice of God, it underscores it. Pharaoh's previous actions warranted his punishment, which consisted of depriving him of the means of repentance. This deprivation, rather than the drowning of his charioteers and the destruction of his army, was his punishment. He had earned, through his sins, the inability to repent of them. This is a canny acknowledgement of the moral problem resident in the biblical text, as well as an elegant solution to it. The background, still inchoate metaphysical issue, however, complicates the picture. The wrinkle is that God had already told Abraham, back in Genesis chapter 15, what was to come in the matter of his descendants and their descent into Egypt. Quote, "And he said to Avram, Know well that your offspring shall be strangers in a land not theirs, and they shall be enslaved and oppressed 400 years. But I will execute judgment on the nation they shall serve, and in the end they shall go free." God's announcement, centuries before the events narrated in Exodus, suggests that the distinction between Pharaoh's self-hardened heart and God's hardening of it is irrelevant. Both occurrences were part of a predestined plan. Here, the medieval philosophical and theological focus on whether God's omniscient foreknowledge is compatible with human freedom of choice is anticipated. Let us turn then directly to the medieval engagement with the problem. The first systematic treatment of the problem is found in the Book of Doctrines and Beliefs by Saadia Gaon, an early 10th century thinker. Saadia adapts the philosophical theology of Islam, known as Kalam, to Rabbinic Judaism. Although not a mere epigone of the Mutazilite expression of Kalam, he is highly indebted to them. The problem of free choice and determinism had long exercised the Muslim world. As in the case of biblical and rabbinic Judaism, so too pre-philosophical Islam struggled with how to reconcile God's knowledge, power, and wisdom with the human freedom necessary for moral action. Some Muslims, both pre-philosophical and from the Asharite school of Kalam, dissolved the tension and denied freedom of choice. The Mutazila did not. They wanted both total divine foreknowledge and control and human freedom of choice, and Saadia had the same aspiration. He is convinced that Judaism must affirm both. His arguments, alas, are less than convincing. Saadia's opening gambit is essentially a Kantian move. Ought implies can. That we ought to do X implies that we can do X. The Torah commands us to do some things and to refrain from doing other things. If we did not have the ability to respond to the commands of the Torah, then the Torah would be senseless. Furthermore, it would have been senseless for God to have given it. As God does not do senseless things, but wants to benefit his creatures in a just and merciful way, he gave them freedom of choice so that they could do his will. And Saadia then details some features of this divinely granted freedom of choice. For example, that it is a disposition that precedes the choosing of any course of action, and that its ideal form is intentional and voluntary. Well, this plainly does not solve the problem. It does little more than reframe it. Granted that God gave humans freedom of choice, but how does that stipulated freedom comport with God's omniscience and omnipotence? What space would omniscience and omnipotence, in the sense of control over all possible events, leave for human agency? Saadia marshals several arguments. First, he appeals to experience. We sense as subjects that we typically have, as contemporary philosophers say, liberty of spontaneity. That is, given a lack of external constraint, we can speak or not, move or not. We can control our bodies. Of course, we could be merely brains in a vat, imagining that we are doing all of these things because a deranged neuroscientist is causing us to imagine them. Appeal to the first-person case, as Wittgenstein has shown us, does not provide the certainty that Saadia or Descartes would like. Saadia's second argument is that one action cannot be attributed to more than one agent. To ascribe a divine role in a given human action, X, is to ascribe two causes, one human, the other divine, to a single effect, a condition that Saadia thinks is untenable. But can two persons not bake a cake? Finally, Saadia falls back on the unfairness of punishing someone for something he did involuntarily. This would impugn the justice of God, which is unacceptable. But even if you are a determinist, you still have to account for the distinction between apparently voluntary action and apparently involuntary action. The distinction remains cogent, whatever the theory might be that purports to explain it. On the atomic theory, my desk is mostly empty space. The theory must still explain the apparent hardness of the wood. None of these arguments do much to advance Saadia's defense of freedom of choice in the face of divine omniscience and omnipotence. Saadia's final argument tries to confront the problem of divine omniscience head on, and he gives us an objection. He says, perhaps someone will ask me further, if God knows that which is going to be before it comes into being, he knows in advance if a certain person will disobey him, now that person must by necessity disobey God, for otherwise God's foreknowledge would not prove to be correct, end quote. Saadia replies that the questioner has uncritically assumed that God's knowledge is causative. The questioner believes that God's knowledge of X causes X. Saadia rejects this supposition. Since God has known X from all eternity, X would, on the knowledge as cause account, have had to exist from all eternity. But that is absurd. X would be coeval with God. X would be godlike. It would share God's eternity. So the most we can assume is that the idea of X existed, so to speak, in the mind of God from logical necessity and causal necessity. It is logically necessary that an omniscient being know everything that there is to know, past, present, and future. That is what the concept of omniscience logically entails. Thus, God knows in advance that someone, N, will choose X, but God's knowledge does not cause N to choose. God knows his own mind. He knows the connection of ideas about X, that he will create X at a certain time, that N will choose X, etc. His knowledge does not constrain N's choice of X. It's still hard, however, to see why God's foreknowledge should not constrain or should be immaterial to N's choice. Maimonides, when faced with the same objection, introduces a radical dichotomy between what we mean by knowledge and what knowledge can mean when applied to God. Saadia does not share Maimonides' negative theology to the same degree. He does, however, gesture in the same direction. In response to the objection, if God knows that a certain person will speak, is it possible for that person to be silent? Saadia answers that if the person were to keep silent, we would have to say that God knew that he would have been silent. We would not have been entitled to say that God knew he would speak. Whatever a person does, that is what God antecedently knew he would do. At first glance, it looks like Saadia is simply practicing flagrantly the post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy. But his reasoning is more subtle than that, or at least I like to believe his reasoning is more subtle than that. He's telling us, I think, that we are not entitled to assume God's point of view, and so are not entitled to frame the question in this manner. The objector supposes that he can postulate what God knows, namely that a certain person will speak and how God knows it. But no one is ever justified in postulating something as if from God's point of view. The most we can say is that whatever has actually occurred was antecedently known by God. We cannot assume the stance of an omniscient knower, even as a thought experiment. But this, alas, is not to win the argument. It is to disown it. It is as if Saadia is saying, let's argue over metaphysics and talk about divine causation and the like, but only up to a point. At a certain point, we have to say that the question is impious and reject it. It was for this sort of reason that the Muslim and Jewish Aristotelians did not have a high regard for the Kalam thinkers as philosophers. And Maimonides is very, very critical of all the kind of arguments that I've just given you in Saadia. Does Maimonides do better? Maimonides' views on free choice and determinism are not quite straightforward. Maimonides is an esoteric thinker. That means he hides his true beliefs. Scholars differ over the extent to which Maimonides masks his own views and over what precisely those views are. In his esoteric writings on this topic, found in the Laws of Repentance in his Code, the Mishneh Torah, and in the final chapter of his ethical treatise, the 8 chapters, Maimonides stringently upholds freedom of choice. He uses arguments quite like Saadia's. In the Guide for the Perplexed, however, the situation is murkier. Maimonides appears to give more play to constraining features and may arguably endorse a soft determinism. Dr. Applebaum, in his presentation yesterday, gave you the key citation from the Laws of Repentance in Maimonides' legal code, which has a robust articulation of the utterly necessary fundamental belief in freedom of choice for Judaism, so I won't repeat it. But I will skip, in the interest of time, skip ahead and just try to summarize Maimonides. Where Maimonides does begin to argue is in the final chapter of the 8 chapters. His view becomes more nuanced. Maimonides continues to assert the fundamental ontological and moral importance of freedom of choice. He shows greater awareness, however, of the natural factors that constrain choice. Maimonides comments on one of the key Talmudic citations that bears on this topic. The citation is, "All is in the hands of heaven except for the fear of heaven." Maimonides comments that the capacity to have fear or awe of heaven, that is of God, is a function of one's freedom. Everything else, however, the all, is, quote, meant to designate only natural phenomena which are not influenced by the will of man, as whether a person is tall or short, whether it is rainy or dry, whether the air is pure or impure, end quote. God predestines the condition of the physical world for all times. Only free will escapes the lattice of causes. Quote, "The divine will ordained everything at creation. All things at all times are regulated by the laws of nature and run their natural course," end quote. Thus, the rabbis say in the Talmud, everything follows its natural course. By this they mean that such statements as a man rises or sits down in accordance with the will of God can be analyzed into God created man as a being whose physical nature is such that he can rise and sit down, and whose mental nature is such that he has the freedom of choice to do so. Unlike the Kalam thinkers who were occasionalists and did not believe in a stable universe governed by physical laws, Maimonides assumes universal causality and necessity. These stop short, however, at the threshold of the human will. In the Guide for the Perplexed, Maimonides comes close to subsuming free choice under general patterns of causality. In the view of some scholars, he actually does so. He writes of 3 kinds of cause: natural, free, and volitional. He means by natural such things as snow always melting when the air becomes warm, or waves being stirred when the wind blows. All of those expressions in the Torah where God appears to cause natural effects through commanding or speaking or calling to things in nature must be understood in the sense of God establishing natural laws at the time of the creation. It is merely a matter of rhetorical style for the prophets to leave out enumerating secondary, intermediate, or proximate causes and invoking the first cause in the relevant instances. Maimonides wants to free God from the micromanagement of earthly affairs. The picture becomes more complicated when we move to the second and third kinds of causation. What is the difference between free choice in a rational being and volition in a non-rational animal? It's perhaps not as much as we would have expected, given the exoteric Maimonides' commitment to indeterminism. I won't read the citation from the guide because it's opaque, so I'll just try to explain it. In the citation, Maimonides appears virtually to equate the causation of irrational animal volition with the rational animal, that is, human free choice. God arouses a volition in animals, he'ir haratzon, the desire of a fish or an insect to do X, in the same way that he necessitates a particular free choice, chayav habechira, in a human being. That's really pretty shocking, given everything else that Maimonides has said. The point of Maimonides' analysis is to show that in all cases of causation, God is not directly involved, but only involved as a first cause. It's almost a kind of deism. But where does that leave free choice? Is not it too reinserted into the causal matrix of creation on a par with natural and animal volitional causation? If one were able to sustain this interpretation, Maimonides' position would be determinist to some degree. Perhaps his view would accord with what is currently called compatibilism. Freedom is thought to be compatible with both causation and determinism. This position is often secured by defining freedom down, as David Hume does, or radically reconceptualizing it, as Spinoza does. Ultimately, Maimonides' philosophical anthropology appears to leave us with human beings who are essentially animals in all but one respect. Their capacity for abstract reasoning enables them to fuse, at least momentarily, with the active intellect, with the divine. When they do so, this purely intellectual transcendence constitutes individual divine providence. Otherwise, the existence of human beings is not fundamentally dissimilar from that of irrational animals who are not subject to providence, but who are subject to causation. How we read Maimonides on this particular point depends upon how we read him in general. Do we ascribe immense weight to one or two phrases as if they disclose his true esoteric view in a subtle, fleeting manner? That's how Leo Strauss reads him, one of the most important interpreters of Maimonides of the last century. Or do we look for continuity in his views across all of his works? And these questions have been unsettled for about 900 years. So we're not going to solve them today. Now, very quickly, my last figure, Bachya ibn Pekuda, is the author of a classic text in the tradition of Jewish virtue ethics called The Duties of the Heart. Bachya treats our problem in the context of an extended philosophical dialogue between the mind and the soul. Bachya's purpose is to persuade his readers that the Torah requires a life of mindfulness, intention, and inner purification. The duties of the heart are higher than what he calls the duties of the limbs. The mind, through grasping true knowledge of God and of the nature of reality, directs the soul, which in turn directs the body. In the dialogue, the soul seeks guidance about metaphysical matters from the mind so that it can conduct itself appropriately in sub-metaphysical, that is, moral matters. The problem of freedom of choice and determinism greatly troubles the soul, who appeals to the mind to cure it of what it calls its worst illness. Its anxiety stems from the belief that the Bible affirms both divine governance of all things and freedom of choice, but that these positions are mutually exclusive. The soul cites Scripture to document its dilemma. Scripture comes down on both sides. The mind responds that the dilemma is in fact generated by biblical texts, but it also inheres in human experience as such and has long been a topic of philosophy. Human beings know themselves to be, as modern philosophers say, subject both to causes and to reasons. As the mind reviews prior Jewish opinion, it claims that there were rabbis who believed in strict indeterminism, as well as strict determinism. The indeterminists, of course, had no problem with affirming God's justice, since reward and punishment would be fully contingent on free human choice. The determinists, however, had to assert that God's justice, given the absence of freedom of choice, is opaque to us. Nonetheless, we must agree that God is just, but that our minds are too weak to make sense of that justice and wisdom and grace. And Bachya then makes a surprising assertion, I quote, "Still other rabbis decided to believe in both schools, that is, to believe in both divine justice and in predetermination, claiming that whoever examines these matters too closely cannot escape sin and failure, no matter how he does it. They said the right way is to act in the belief that man's actions are entrusted to him so that he earns reward or punishment, and to try to do everything that may benefit us before God, both in this world and the next. On the other hand, we should rely on him with the submission of those who know that all actions, movements, benefits, and misfortunes lie under God's rule and power and depend on his permission and decree." Now, at first it seems that Bachya's rabbis are simply hedging their bets. Either view could be the correct one, so it is prudent, if intellectually incoherent, to maintain both of them. I think his position is deeper than that, however. Bachya believes that both views are necessary. Both are powerful, if irreconcilable, descriptions of the way things are. Our ultimate situation vis-a-vis the way things are is one of ignorance, but this ignorance is blessed. Coming up against the limits of pure reason, to use a Kantian term, we turn back to practical reason. Our metaphysical ignorance frees us to pursue a moral path, to work on the duties of the heart. Bach's view thus seems to be similar to Kant's, albeit within his own medieval idiom. For Kant, we are both organisms, subject to mechanical causality, and persons, subject to the causality of freedom. For Bachya, we are both part of a great chain of divinely regulated beings and individuals who must develop their own interior bond with the divine. Bachya's view, although less philosophically developed than those of Saadia and Maimonides, points more clearly toward the human matter that is at stake in the perennial discussion of this problem. The anxiety, that's Bach's word, the anxiety that attends the thought of diminished agency and of the personhood related to agency arrests us. That the organic creature defined by causes can overcome the one who is a person, that Parkinson's or Alzheimer's or cancer can swallow what one is a fundamental fear. A person asserts personhood through action in accord with reasons, shaped in a space which may or may not be free, but must at least be thought of as free in order for reason to be true to itself. Perhaps freedom is a necessary illusion. Perhaps the causality that embraces the human is as inexorable on every level as that which embraces the grass that withers, the flower that fades. Or perhaps a miraculous grace pervades the domain of the human and lifts it out of the causal matrix, granting it permission to interrogate and shape its own momentary life. The mystery to which Bachya and Kant point may be the last word, if we are simultaneously to affirm the universality of causation and the integrity of reason. Thank you.
Our final speaker in this morning's session, after which we'll have our panel, is B. Alan Wallace. He began his studies of Tibetan Buddhism, language and culture in 1970 at the University of Göttingen in Germany, and then continued his studies over the next 14 years in India, Switzerland, and here in the United States. He was ordained as a Buddhist monk in 1975 by the Dalai Lama, and he's taught Buddhist meditation and philosophy throughout the world ever since. He's also served as an interpreter for numerous Tibetan scholars and contemplatives, including the Dalai Lama. He's a graduate of Amherst College and received his PhD in religious studies at Stanford, following which he taught for 4 years in the Department of Religious Studies at the University of California at Santa Barbara. And he is now the founder and president of the Santa Barbara Institute for Consciousness Studies. He's edited, translated, authored, and contributed to more than 30 books on Tibetan Buddhism, medicine, language, and culture, and the interface between science and religion. And this morning, he'll be talking about a Buddhist view of free will, beyond determinism and indeterminism. Alan Wallace.
To create a little bit of a segue between what I'll be talking about and what we just heard, this excellent presentation. Isaac Bashevis Singer was apparently asked at one point whether he believed in free will. And his response allegedly was, "Of course I do. Do I have any choice?" I think I'd go along with that. I revised my presentation a little bit, added a little bit when I learned that I had an extra 10 minutes, to segue also with the presentations we heard yesterday. Happily, in this conference, we're hearing quite a variety of perspectives. Yesterday with somewhat more homogeneity, today with definitely more diversity. And I think it's a wonderful thing in a single conference to have so many perspectives presented, which are clearly incompatible in some very important ways. My own sense of this is that resolution in the midst of such diversity will frequently not be arrived at by way of logic or reasoning alone, but rather by the focusing of attention. And I think William James in this statement sheds light on a lot of the differences that arise in discussions across worldviews, across perspectives. I think it's quite ingenious, frankly. Here's a statement. The subjects adhered to become real subjects. Attributes adhere to real attributes. The existence adhere to real existence. So adhere to, attended to. While subjects disregarded become imaginary subjects. The attributes disregarded, erroneous attributes, and the existence disregarded, an existence in no man's land, in the limbo where footless fancies dwell. Habitually and practically, we do not count these disregarded things as existence at all. They are not even treated as appearances, they are treated as if they were mere waste, equivalent to nothing at all. He sums up this theme in a very succinct statement. For the moment, what we attend to is reality. For the last 400 years, the great successes of the natural sciences have been largely driven by the focusing of attention outwards, using the tools of technology to measure and try to understand objective, physical, quantifiable processes in nature. It's been a terrific success. So much consensual knowledge having arisen and emerging by way of clear progress over these last 400 years, I think it would be difficult to argue that comparable progress has been made in theology over that same period. Not to say that there's no progress at all, but to say that theologians have come to consensus as physicists, chemists, biologists, and so forth, I think that would be a tough row to hoe. Likewise for philosophers, or the whole field of philosophy. Can it be said that philosophy has progressed in a manner comparable to that of the natural sciences? Brilliant philosophy, to be sure. Progress of that sort, I think that would be one more tough row to hoe. And so out of the extraordinary success, especially the relative success of the natural sciences vis-a-vis religion and philosophy, it's easy to draw the conclusion, which I think is fundamentally erroneous, but nevertheless quite facile, to think that, well, then after all, the only viable mode of inquiry into the natural world is that of the natural sciences. And anything else, as we heard yesterday, at least implied, if not stated explicitly, is basically a waste of time. In other words, we allow our very definition, our very worldview as a whole to be defined by the limitations of a particular strategy. And what is left out? That which we disregard. The world of subjective experience, the world of ideas, ironically enough, since science is driven by the world of ideas. We draw from Paul C.W. Davies, outstanding astronomer, cosmologist in Arizona. And he ties this together a bit, I think, with this statement that a true observation of the physical world, bearing in mind what we attend to is our reality, what have scientists been attending to, making observations of, a true observation of the physical world. He, referring to John Archibald Wheeler, one of the most brilliant theoretical physicists of the late 20th century, still alive, I'm happy to say, he maintained even something as simple as the decay of an atom must not only produce an indelible record, it must somehow impart meaningful information. It is not an observation, it's not a true observation until or unless it imparts meaningful information. Measurement implies a transition from the realm of mindless stuff to the realm of knowledge. How do we make that transition? How did it occur in the course of natural evolution, that we go from inorganic molecules to organic molecules, to life, to a realm of knowledge, of knowing? Simply to equate knowing with the brain strikes me as a deliberate ignorance of the problem. that the brain is correlated to all the states of consciousness that we know. At least this is a very working hypothesis, a very reasonable hypothesis. A correlation does not imply, logically or empirically, identity. What is that relationship, and what is left out? The word meaning came up a lot yesterday. Whether the world is meaningful or meaningless. From what perspective? Observing what? Physicists observe the purposeless behavior of inorganic configurations of mass energy, the movement of the moon around the Earth, or the movement of galaxies, the movement of stars and so forth, or down to the elementary particle level, electrons, photons, and so forth. One does not ask for the meaning of why a particular particle moved in such and such a way. It is purposeless. It just happens. And to understand it is to understand the regularities, the patterns, or perhaps the laws, so-called governing such behavior. But one doesn't ask why the electron chose to go in one direction as opposed to another. Biologists, on the other hand, observe the purposeful behavior of conscious organisms. Ants operating in an ant colony, rabbits in a warren, primates, tribes of chimpanzees and so forth, where the themes, the purposes of survival and procreation seem to be quite dominant. Now there is purpose that we find in living organisms that we do not find in the movements of individual particles. And we try to understand, the biologists try to understand this purposeful behavior of living organisms largely in terms, if not exclusively in terms, of genetics and behavior. That's what we heard about yesterday with respect to human behavior. Why do we behave in the way we do? And then we have these genetic influences one after another, and then there's environmental. What I didn't hear yesterday was, in addition to the genetic, in addition to the environmental, this is what we humans contribute to our behavior. That didn't come up somehow. Somehow it was left out. How did that happen? Because we're not attending to that. We're attending to the genetics, we're attending to the environmental, and therefore that becomes real for us, whereas the realm of ideas, ideals, our own aspirations, our own hopes and fears as subjective agents, we're not attended to, winds up being shifted off to the realm of epiphenomena, mere appearances, or nothing whatsoever. Philosophers, those who are truly love wisdom, have a passion for wisdom, observe, among other things, the meaningful behavior of human agents. Why do we behave as we do as agents, not simply as living organisms driven by imperatives of survival and procreation? So coming back to this statement by William James, succinctly and pointedly stated, our belief and attention are the same fact for the moment. What we attend to is reality. What types of reality are we attending to? What types are we ignoring? And those realities we ignore, how can we possibly take them seriously? We don't even count them as existence. So he says, so perhaps the issue here is not so much to apply compelling syllogisms, as meaningful as that may be, but to broaden the scope of our attention, to attend to a wider range of phenomena, objective and subjective, quantitative and quantifiable. Qualitative and quantifiable. I don't think we speak of the meaningfulness of an electron's behavior. I've never heard of people speaking of rabbits' meaningful behavior, that one rabbit leads a more meaningful life than another. I've not heard that come up. I don't know what that would entail. More babies? That would just be more utility. That is, you passed on your gene pool. But we do speak, whether or not we go along with it, we do hear frequently of the phrase, a meaningful human life, that a life may be more or less meaningful. We are animals. I think one brief glance indicates that. We are driven by an imperative to survive, for many of us, although not all, an imperative to procreate. But once that is said and done, once we have survived, once we feel some level of comfort that we're not in imminent danger of perishing, our bellies are full, we are warm, we're taken care of. What then? Why is it that astronomers, biologists, philosophers and people in many other walks of life are so keen on pursuing understanding that is not relevant to, is not conducive to, does not support our yearning to survive and procreate. Why does anybody care about the phases of the moon and what causes them? Does it help you to survive better or have more babies? Why poetry? Why music? Why art? Why philosophy? Because we consider it meaningful. It is distinctively human, as far as we know. The pursuit of understanding, to my mind, is an integral feature of what makes a life meaningful. Shall we pursue understanding that is not purely utilitarian in its nature? The pursuit of virtue, a word I hardly ever hear come up in psychology for its intense concern of distancing itself from religion, virtue being such a religious term, and yet life without virtue seems so bleak. Virtues of kindness, compassion, wisdom, patience, calm, equanimity, empathy, generosity. These are not specifically religious virtues, and yet a life that is dissociated from any kind of virtue, that is not oriented towards the cultivation of virtue, of being better human beings, strikes me as a life hardly worth living. An integral feature of a meaningful life. And finally, this pursuit of genuine happiness, about which the Greeks, especially Aristotle, had so much to say, of such depth. Eudaimonia, human flourishing, a quality of well-being that arises not simply because we're lucky, not simply because we encounter pleasant stimuli, pleasant people, pleasant environment, pleasurable sensory input, or even pleasant imagination and happy memories, but a quality of flourishing that arises from the very quality of our being. Aristotle, human flourishing as a being at work of the soul in accordance with virtue, and should there be more than one virtue, in accordance with the highest virtue. The notion that somehow the pursuit of understanding and the pursuit of virtue are inextricably linked, or maybe inextricably linked, with the pursuit of human flourishing, genuine happiness, is a notion that has almost entirely vanished from the modern world, and yet so familiar in ancient Greece, so familiar in early Christianity. I don't know this, but I would be very confident a central theme in at least certain strains of the Jewish tradition. In Taoism, it's definitely there. In Buddhism, it runs throughout. In Hinduism, very, very prevalent. And now suddenly this great absence. What have we forgotten? That these three pursuits may be profoundly interrelated, as opposed to disenfranchised as we see them so often in the modern world. Which brings us back then to an ancient period, 2,500 years ago in India. Ancient, a different culture, a different continent outside of our Mediterranean sphere, and yet in some ways so familiar. There were visions in this very pluralistic society of classical India that advocated various forms of determinism. One being that, in terms of causality, not only material causality, but also mental causality, that everything that happens is simply due past karma. In other words, fate, destiny. Your child dies at the age of 2, you live a happy life until the age of 90, you win the lottery, you lose your whole livelihood by way of somebody else's dishonesty. It's your karma, and there's nothing you can do about it. There's a view. Here's another one that was prevalent in India, again, 2,500, 3,000 years ago, that we just heard about from the Mediterranean basin, from the Near East, and that is everything is due to the will of God. God is omnipotent, God is a macro manager, a micromanager, God does it all. We are absolutely impotent, because we're not God. We're about as potent as iron filings next to a magnet. Or everything is simply due to fate, without attributing this to karma, to past lives, actions in past lives. There is just fate. In other words, a type of Laplacian predetermination. That everything is set. There were also views of indeterminism. Oh, and by the way, in that regard, the notion of equating a human being with a brain and a brain being a purely biological organism operating according to the laws of physics and biology, then a human being operates entirely according to the laws of physics and biology, which does not include teleology. Therefore, a human being becomes a robot, pre-programmed, genetics interfacing with environment, determinism. That's assuming that there are no quantum effects in the brain that is operating according to the classical laws of 19th century physics. It is not at all certain, unlike what we heard yesterday, it is not certain at all yet that there are no quantum effects in the brain. There may be. Whether they are there or not will be discovered by people who think they are there. If they're not there, then the people who think they are there will discover negative evidence. But simply assuming that there are no quantum effects in the brain guarantees you won't ask the question. There may be, and there are people actively working in that field now. We don't know, but does that really help us? If there are quantum effects in the brain and these quantum effects are stochastic, are random, what on earth could that have to do with free will? It just allows you to act chaotically or randomly. And this too, without any reference to quantum mechanics, of course, was one of the many views in pluralistic India 2,500 years ago, and that is things happened for no reason at all. Why did you do that? I don't know. It just happened. Not freedom of will, it's just happened. So there were a lot of different views. Happily, there was no church, there was no university, there was no government in India that demanded homogeneity of views. There was never any great fusion of church and state in India, to the great blessing of India. And so it gave rise to and allowed for pluralism of views. And along comes the Buddha 2,500 years ago, and he rejected all of the above. He rejected determinism on purely pragmatic grounds, where he said it stifles moral responsibility and the motivation to strive for liberation. And that is, if you think you are locked in, you are a robot, you are simply impotent, then where are you possibly going to have any inspiration, any incentive, any basis for taking responsibility for your behavior, since you believe you don't have any? And likewise, why on earth would you ever strive for your own betterment, to be a better human being, a freer human being, to aspire for liberation? The very aspiration would be snuffed out if you think that you're locked in, that you're a cog in a great machine. You wipe that out. But then we have this other view of indeterminism, and he rejected this on similar grounds, this belief that experiences arise without dependence on any prior causes. He said this also stifles moral responsibility and the motivation to strive for liberation. That too is a dead end. It's a no-brainer. Because if it's just stochastic, it's just random, then why strive for anything? Because whatever comes up is going to be just random. It will disallow any type of continuity of a focus, disallow any type of momentum building from one's own behavior, one's aspirations, one's practices, one's training, because things happen for no reason at all. So rejected both of these. This theme of middle way crops up in many, many contexts in Buddhism. The notion of free will is ever so often hinged upon the assumption that there is some type of an autonomous agent, whether it's homunculus hanging out in the brain someplace, or an immortal soul, an ego, a superego, but some type of an entity that is me, that stands apart from and somehow controls the activities of the body and mind. And the Buddha specifically rejected that. He said there is no such autonomous self that exists either among or apart from the aggregates, that is the functions, the processes, the constituents of the body and mind. There is no autonomous self existing either among them, that is not in some portion of the brain or the heart or the gallbladder, nor is there some type of an ethereal entity called a self that hovers above and outside of and yet controlling the body and mind. He rejected such a notion on empirical grounds. He said, where's the evidence? When you carefully examine the processes of the mind that are arising from moment to moment, their interrelationship with physiological processes of moment to moment arising in a relationship to the environment moment to moment, where do you find the great conductor of the orchestra? The top down, the puppeteer behind the veil. He took a naturalistic approach, understanding the processes of the body and mind taking place in relationship to the environment as internally consistent, without any type of ego intervention from some supernatural self. But now, if there is no independent self, as he maintained, and the Buddhist tradition has maintained uniformly ever since, who could possess such free will that operates independently of prior causes and conditions? And frankly, what could that even mean? How can we make wise choices, free choices that are uninfluenced by the past? What would that even look like? To make a choice that's not informed by your memory, that's hovering in some type of a timeless realm, launching into the future, but an amnesiac with respect to the past. I think it doesn't make any sense. So if there is no independent self, then there's no bearer of any free will that stands outside of the nexus of causality. It looks like we're going into determinism. If the self as an unmoved mover is purely an illusion, this self that stands outside the nexus of causality, but is calling the shots by some type of a microcosmic divine intervention, if that's an illusion, then mustn't it follow that free will is also an illusion? If there's no carrier, there's nothing to be carried. No carrier free will, there's no one to exert it or to implement it. So it looks like the Buddhists are in a pickle. How can there possibly be free will if there's no agent to implement it? Just by the way, the issue of free will hardly even comes up in Buddhism. We find it comes up in early Judaism, in the Greek thought, of course, in Christianity, very, very dominant. It's now cropping up because these are the roots of our civilization. Free will is being discussed, refuted, defended, and so forth. The issue hardly even comes up in Buddhism. I wouldn't even know how to translate it that would be meaningful, or that it would evoke some kind of interesting discussion in Sanskrit or in Tibetan. But what does come up is the role of the mind. As the Buddha stated all in this very, very often quoted statement from the Dhammapada, all phenomena are preceded by the mind, issue forth from the mind and consist of the mind. Phenomena as in experiences. He's not referring to the mind creating electrons or the mind creating objective phenomena, but all the experiences that we have being, rooted in mentality, rooted in consciousness, emerging from consciousness in relationship, of course, to the environment. So the mind is taking a central role, and autonomous ego is not. Within the mind, within the many processes of the mind, what now is central when it comes to our behavior, it is will, O monks, that I call karma. Karma simply means action, but what is the driving force within karma as such that warrants this label karma? It is will, volition. Having willed, one acts through the body, speech, or mind. So now this takes a very central role, volition, as being the very essence of karma, as being the driving force for our lives. He didn't say free, he simply said volition, our choices, our decisions. So if we looked at this term free will within Buddhist context, where I said it's rather, you don't find it in its native turf, how might this term be understood within the Buddhist context? And I would venture to say that one could say, from a Buddhist perspective, there is a measure of free will insofar as one can reflect on one's options and decide on the best course of action in terms of its moral suitability. Moral suitability means, in the Buddhist context, I can go this way or I can go that way. I can choose this or I can choose that. William James, by the way, pointed out once again how utterly essential attention is in this regard. Attention and moral responsibility. What I attend to is likely the direction I'm going to go. If I'm tempted to engage in an action that would give rise to detrimental effects for myself and others, and I shift my attention away from it to an alternative, I'll probably avoid the detrimental action. But if my mind remains fixated on that which I know I should not do, because it would be harmful, I'll probably fall into it anyway. So free will, as being entailing intelligence, wisdom, foresight, the ability to make a choice in ways that are congruent with one's own and others' flourishing, our happiness, that do not undermine our well-being, that do not damage or are not destructive for ourselves or others. Free will, one would find a lot of consensus there, I think. But now, why does this issue of free will, why is it not so central in Buddhism as it is in the theistic religions or as it is in ancient Greece? Perhaps one thing is Buddhism is not theistic, as are these Abrahamic religions. in the sense of having to worry about the existence of a supernatural God who is omniscient, omnipotent, calling all the shots, and does or does not miraculously give us free will. It doesn't come up in Buddhism. In fact, of course, such a deity that is omnipotent, omniscient, and controlling is explicitly rejected, as is an autonomous self rejected in Buddhism. But the empirical observation, the phenomenological observation in Buddhism that runs through the entire 2,500 years is that if we simply observe our behavior of people who have not cultivated their hearts, their minds, who are not, how do you say, specifically devoting themselves to their own spiritual maturation, the observation is that obviously we are not free. Addiction is not confined to people who have a medical condition. Insofar as our own minds are dominated by, on occasion, mental afflictions, such as craving, another word for addiction, or hostility, resentment, anger, hatred, or just delusion, just getting things wrong. Insofar as our minds are constrained by these afflictions, we are not free. Insofar as thereon hangs the tale. This term comes up in modern psychology. A friend of mine uses this term a lot. Paul Ekman, professor emeritus at University of California, San Francisco, speaks of the refractory period. A refractory period being a fleeting period, it could be a matter of minutes, in which the mind becomes fixated on a certain situation but distorts it, can only think of that situation along a certain groove that is very limiting. For example, one may be very angry about something or at someone, and in that moment when the mind is utterly dominated by anger or resentment or suspicion, able to perceive that person's behavior only through that lens. The mind is in the grip of an emotion. One's intelligence may be very active and very sharp within that very narrow spectrum and be completely dormant outside of that spectrum. One becomes dumbed down for a relatively brief period, hopefully. It may be under the domination of anger, resentment. It may be under the domination of craving, where one becomes fixated, passionately fixated on the acquisition of a certain object, a thing, a person, and so forth. And as long as the mind is in the grip of that passion, one can't think straight. One is not free, or one is simply stupefied, or one is delusional, whether through intoxication of a substance, of alcohol, or stupefied by dumb ideas. Racism is a dumb idea. But when a person's mind is dominated by racism, one is not free. That's the bad news. Based upon an enormous amount of experience, Buddhists also posit a dimension of awareness that can be and has been repeatedly accessed experientially, called a dimension of awareness called the brightly shining mind. Beyond the 6 modes of ordinary consciousness, that is the 5 sensory modes and mental consciousness, this brightly shining mind, a dimension of awareness that is pure, that is luminous, clear, unconfigured, unstructured, uninfluenced by craving, hostility, delusion. A dimension of awareness that is innately free, that can be accessed, but that is obscured. And that brightly shining mind, it is posited as a working hypothesis, this is the source of freedom. Outside of the configuration, outside of the habituation, this is freedom. Shantideva, one of the great 7th century contemplatives, poets, philosophers from the Buddhist tradition in India, made this claim that a person whose mind is distracted lives between the fangs of mental afflictions. That is, insofar as the mind is simply distracted, wandering, ADHD to varying degrees, this person lives a life between the fangs of mental afflictions, vulnerable to and not free from. And so therefore, in the Buddhist training, meditative practice, shamatha, which literally means quiescence or calm, is presented as a way of training the attention so that we can free our minds, free our attention from compulsive and obsessive behavior. What William James called sustained voluntary attention, the ability to focus our attention where we will, with continuity, with clarity, without it being subjugated by such mental afflictions. There's a practice that I've taught quite extensively. It's very, very prominent in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, called settling the mind in its natural state, in which one simply observes mental events arising from moment to moment to moment. Focuses on them unwaveringly, on thoughts, discursive thoughts, mental images, desires, emotions, attending to them, but without being absorbed by them and carried away by them. The awareness of a mental process allows for the freedom, allows the possibility of freedom, not to simply be abducted by it and carried away by it. Vipassana, or insight practice, is then a mode of practice designed to yield spiritual freedom such that the mind is no longer even encumbered by the afflictions of the mind. We move to this whole realm of Mahayana Buddhism, specifically Madhyamaka, or the Middle Way, where the theme of emptiness comes up a lot. Emptiness as in the absence of an inherent existence, the Ding an sich of Kant, things existing in and of themselves, independent of context, independent of modes of perception, independent of conceptual frameworks, already quite self-sufficient in and of themselves, and that is exactly what Buddhism refutes, again for lack of evidence. And the assertion here that runs through all of Mahayana Buddhism, certainly at least this school, is that all phenomena, whether they are galaxies, whether they are electrons, whether they are feelings, or whether they are thoughts, all phenomena, and not just the self or the I, all are devoid of such self-existence or inherent existence, implicitly independent existence. But on the contrary, all phenomena, all conditioned phenomena arise in dependence upon three factors. Prior causes and conditions. That is, the thoughts that we have, the volitions that arise, the movements of galaxies, the movements of a photon in a double-slit experiment, these arise in dependence upon prior causes and conditions. Are they completely determined by? No, that's why there are three factors. But prior causes and conditions are an element, a very important one, for all causally conditioned phenomena. Secondly, phenomena exist in dependence upon their concurrent parts and attributes. That is, it's not a causal dependency, that is, not causal in the sense of sequential, it's simultaneous. An electron cannot exist apart from its charge, its location, its spin, its mass. But these attributes, these constituent attributes of an electron, don't precede it. You don't first get its spin, its location, mass, and charge, and then get an electron. But if you take away those constituent parts, you don't have a naked electron existing all by itself either. So it's a mereological dependence, and this goes for all phenomena. A phenomenon that has attributes is dependent upon those attributes, but has a simultaneous dependence. And finally, the most subtle and interesting of these dependences is that of conceptual designation. How is it that a whole becomes a whole and has parts? How does a part become a part rather than just being its own whole? What is it that congeals reality into these lumps, these chunks of phenomena that have attributes, but take away the attribute one by one and you don't have the whole left over? And that goes for mind, for people, for galaxies, for the universe itself as a whole. It is conceptual designation that is the great cookie cutter that isolates one phenomenon apart from another, not by sheer discovery of what was already there, but by superimposing a grid and thereby creating demarcations. So this is a simultaneous causality as well, and that is in adopting a certain stance, a framework, in identifying a phenomenon as such, it arises to one's mind in that same instant. It is an influence, but it is simultaneous influence. Therefore, by shifting one's conceptual designation, the reality that is so designated also shifts. The central point here in Buddhist philosophy is that phenomena do not designate themselves. They do not define or identify themselves. It is conceptual designation that isolates them and makes them as such. But the conceptual designation may be shifted from one framework to another. Another type of causality, but it's simultaneous causality rather than sequential. This has a practical applications, many, many practical applications in Buddhist practice that enables one to shift the type of reality one is experiencing. One is beset with some type of adversity, perhaps ill health. And one thinks, woe is me, how terrible it is. Why me? Why should this come to me or my family? What a terrible thing. This is awful. One so designates it, as if it is inherently real from its own side. Adversity knocks on your door and it already defines itself as adversity, until one recognizing that's not the case. That one may shift one's perspective on the experience, to give the trite phrase, lemonade from lemons, but shift it and no longer regard it as adversity, but regard it, see how it may be beneficial, see how it may be conducive to one's own flourishing, broadening one's own understanding, providing oneself with an opportunity for patience, for compassion, for empathy, and so on. And so a central theme of this mind training, it's called Lojong in Tibetan Buddhism, is to treat experiences as if we're an alchemist, transmuting them by shifting one's conceptual designation, by shifting one's conceptual framework, shifting one's attitude and perspective on events, so that they don't simply arise as, this is something good that happened to me, this is something bad, but recognizing this is a collaborative venture. We are participants in the reality we experience. It's not just dished up to us by God, by biology, or by fate. In the discussions of causality and free will, time looms very large. Do prior causes and conditions utterly predetermine the present? Is the future already set in concrete? The assumption underlying this, of course, is that time is absolute. Things are inexorably rolling along prior to subsequent, grinding away. But the Buddhist view here is that time itself, together with space, time, matter, consciousness, mind, human identity, all of these phenomena, but including time, has no inherent nature of its own. Time itself is dependent upon conceptual designation. It has no existence in and of itself, independent of conceptual designation. Paul Davies wrote a very interesting article on this, I imagine several. But the whole issue of time, the nature of time in modern physics, especially when one takes the principles of quantum mechanics and applies them to the cosmos as a whole, the universe as a whole, the problem of time is that the problem of frozen time. Time slips out of the equation unless you introduce an observer, someone to say now, as opposed to past and future. If this is the case, as counterintuitive as it may seem, that time has no inherent nature, no absolute or objective nature of its own, then the past does not inherently precede the present, nor the present inherently precede the future, but rather all the events of the three times arise only relative to cognitive frames of reference, but not in and of themselves. And that's the central theme here. It's an ontological relativity, that we can't speak of the existence of anything independent of the cognitive frame of reference by means of which we have apprehended or engaged with or attended to that reality. To try to speak of an absolutely objective universe independent of all modes of inquiry is to speak of something that is unknowable in principle. This too is applied in Buddhism, Vajrayana Buddhism, of taking the fruition of one's spiritual path as one's path itself. Now, this relates to the past as well. The past seems to be set in concrete, unlike the future. The past just has simply happened, right? Whereas the future is still unshaped clay. But the Buddhist position would say, not so fast. There's a nice little aphorism from psychology, it's never too late to have a happy childhood. Buddhism would go along with that. How is your childhood influencing your present? Relative to your cognitive frame of reference of how you view, you remember, you interpret your past. Shift your interpretation, shift your focus on what are you attending to in your past, and you are shifting how the past influences you. The past is not simply an absolutely given, especially considering how much of it there is. How it influences us is very selective on how we focus our attention. As for the past, so for the future, even more so perhaps, we attend, and I won't try to unpack this at all fully, but it is some of the most, most profound aspects of Buddhist practice, I believe. of anticipating the future, envisioning the future, drawing a reality of the future into the present and allowing that future reality to influence one's present behavior, one's present view of reality, including one's own identity. I won't elaborate on that, time is just about up. But I'll come back to John Archibald Wheeler in the last slide. Progress in science. I think it's broader than that. Progress in understanding of reality. Not getting caught up by just hanging out with our peers, people of the same tribe, people of the same church. Whether it's the church scientific, using the rubric of T.H. Huxley 120 years ago, whether it's a religious church, not just hanging out with people of our own congregation, but listening, as we heard yesterday. Progress in science, progress in humanity owes more to the clash of ideas than the steady accumulation of facts. To listen to views that disturb one, for which perhaps the immediate response will be condescension or ridicule. Boy, what I heard yesterday was so, blah, blah, blah. Some people almost certainly, I hope, have that same response to what I'm saying here. Man, what is this guy talking about? So dissonant with what I regard to be reality. Yesterday was very comfortable, but what did we hear today? By Maimonides and Shantideva and this. What's up with that? That's where progress lies. By a clash of ideas, challenging assumptions, and arousing us to attend closely to facets of reality that we have hitherto and quite comfortably ignored. So I'm grateful to the organizers of this conference for bringing such a diversity of views. I eagerly anticipate listening to the later presentations and attending closely. Thank you for your close attention.
Hi, my name is Tao Jiang from Rutgers. Thank you very much for the panelists for the very interesting presentation. I was here yesterday too, and I think I observed an interesting phenomenon about the discussion on the free will. What I see is less about the discussion about the free will rather than sort of different ways of framing the discussion. So it's, we're talking about different issues that the free will is supposed to address, whether it's a psychological or legal or theological or moral, obviously, or the problem of evil or the problem of, and choice and so on and so forth. I wonder whether the panel can address, the fact, whether there's something to that, or whether there's something peculiar about the free will that doesn't seem to lend itself to be studied as such. It's because it's obviously not a natural kind. It's not like a faculty of the human, of human being or soul or mind that we can sort of study as as whether it's as a human eyes, or human ears, and so on and so forth. I wonder whether there's something to that or not. Thank you.
Okay. Who'd like to tackle that first?
Well, one of the things I tried to bring out in my presentation was I think every culture in its own way encounters this problem and tries to frame it within its own evolving idioms. So while I would agree that, or I made the observation in passing that Jewish texts don't really talk about free will, they talk about free choice. I'm not entirely sure whether there's a lot of significance in that distinction or only a little significance, but for the most part, the Jewish texts that deal with this problem don't look into some sort of topology of the human mind. Will does not come up as much as an ability to choose. So I would agree that it's not a natural kind in the sense that squirrels are a natural kind, but it seems to me it's a natural experience of human beings. Just in our introspection, we always discover ourselves to be beings who are subject to both reasons and causes, and reasons are different from causes, although interestingly medieval Hebrew has the same word for both. But I would not completely agree that it's not a natural kind. That's not the term I would use, but I think it's a natural experience of human beings.
Well, I would agree with that statement, and I would extend it one step further and say that it isn't really just an experience of introspection. It's an experience of attribution to others, that we perceive others as making free choices, sometimes mistakenly, and sometimes we're mistaken about ourselves in our perceptions. But I believe it is an important natural perception, and the idea of natural kind has to do with categorization, and I don't really see it as terribly relevant here.
Okay, Sarah.
Thank you. My name is Jacob. I'm a neurobiologist on my way from University of Wisconsin to Washington University. I'd like to address this to the most recent speaker about Buddhism, or anyone else who feels they want to answer. You cited one of Buddha's concerns about the possible consequence of believing ourselves to be unfree, namely that we might lose the motivation to strive for spiritual liberation or for moral responsibility. I'm a little bit skeptical that that would in fact be a consequence. It seems to me that we feel a desire to be moral and to improve ourselves, that feeling is a very real, very physical, biologically manifested desire that is both caused and causal. And I don't think it's fundamentally different from the feeling we have a feeling of hunger, for instance, which is caused and which causes us to want to eat. And I don't think anyone thinks that if we decided or realized or accepted that we were unfree, that we would therefore cease to feel hunger, or that hunger would cease to motivate us to eat. So why do you think that if we accept it, or why does Buddha think, or why do we in general think that if we accepted unfreedom that we would lose the desire to be moral or to strive for spiritual freedom, and why would that desire cease to be causal? Thank you.
Certainly it's true that an impulse like hunger is not voluntary. At the same time, one may be hungry, but trying to keep one's weight down and decide not to eat even though the hunger is there. So choice may come in. I think it's a matter of falling out to its logical end. The notion of predetermination as in defined as at any given point of time there is one and only one possible future. That's one way I've seen it defined. Daniel Dennett defined it in that way and made his most recent book on the topic on that basis. Number one, I agree with you. I'm not sure this would be true for everyone. That is, by accepting determination, that would take the wind out of the sails to behave morally in a responsible fashion. On the other hand, if one takes it strictly, as was considered back in classical India, that frankly we are not making any choices at all. The illusion of free will, as we saw as the title of Daniel Wegner's book, that we have there's the appearance of making choices, but in fact we don't make any choices at all, any more than your laptop decides when you push the button, well, today's kind of raining, I think I won't turn on, you know? So in the absence of choices altogether, because this is what is implied in this strict determinism that Buddha is refuting, if one took that very seriously, then one might quite conceivably just become flaccid and thinking, well, if there are no choices, then I'll just go with the flow. I'll be a piece of driftwood flowing down the stream of time, but there's nothing I can do about it anyway. Final point, because I don't want to go on too long, very briefly. Moral responsibility, I think the whole notion of anybody else being culpable for their behavior has to be thrown out. Any more than, we don't punish our laptops when they crash. We don't punish trackers if there's no oil and the engine burns up. We don't punish animals if they behave. We may, as they say, put them down or restrain them, but especially machines, we just don't have the notion of punishing because they don't make any choices, right? If we regard human beings as machines, then the whole notion of punishment and reward should be equally thrown out?
I would turn that around and say that because we're a social species and with a high amount of differentiation of roles, we want to attribute responsibility to others. It's actually necessary to hold people responsible for their actions, and that the perception of free will and the perception of responsibility arises as part of our social being. It's very different in that sense from hunger, which is common to isolated as well as to social animals.
I'm not sure whether people have free will, but about laptops, I have absolutely no question. They do whatever they please. Next question.
Thank you. My name is Paul Rao. I am a retired physicist from the Johns Hopkins University. And I want to ask the question that you just brought up, namely the difference between ourselves and laptops. But I won't go that far. Rather, I will restrict my question to the difference between ourselves and our predecessors, the animals. Whether it is a matter of the soul, or whether it is a matter of other behavioral issues, such as right and wrong, freedom of choice, free will, and so on and so forth, we seem to make a sharp distinction between the animal world and ourselves as humans. To what extent are we justified in doing that, considering the most recent advances in the neurosciences, genetics, physics, and everything else?
Who would like to tackle that? David?
Well, I'm not sure I understood the question completely, but it's partly one of differentiating between humans and animals. I think anyone who knows about dogs would see that with respect to free will and responsibility, that the differentiation between human and animal is tenuous. I mean, dogs are part of our society, are part of our human society, and they're trained to behave in very elaborate ways within human society, whether it's keeping their feces confined or whether it's rescuing or guarding, and they're blamed when they don't do it, and they look guilty and show regret. I think consideration of at least that one other species makes it very hard to draw a sharp line. And I really think in terms of a social species, and we include another species in our society.
So are you saying that there is no sharp line?
There is no
Sharp line.
I think there's no sharp line.
I can respond briefly from the Buddhist perspective here, and that is the notion of man somehow supernaturally having free will and an immortal soul, as opposed to all the animals having neither, is one more thing that never crops up in Buddhism. And that is the theme that comes up so prominently is not all humans or humanity or man, but rather all sentient beings. And so in this regard, there's a continuum, a spectrum of freedom, and the greater the intelligence, the imagination, the greater mental balance we have, and so forth, then the greater the possibility of freedom. But it is an utterly smooth spectrum. On occasion, human beings act worse than many of the animals we like to have as pets. And on other occasions, we act in utterly sublime ways that we will rarely, if ever, see on the part of a dog or a chimpanzee. But it's an utterly smooth spectrum.
Yeah, I think one of the things I very much like about Buddhism that always comes to mind when I hear a lecture in Buddhism is its absolute rejection of reifying the self. It sees the use of the word self as a category mistake if self is meant to indicate something compact rather than serve as a description of various complex functions. I think we have the same problem with freedom. It seems to me a lot of the questions here, the discussion has been about, to sound overly philosophical and clumsy, the ontology of freedom. You know, at what level is this real? I think perhaps this is why Judaism, Jewish texts don't like free will, because will sounds like something reified. It sounds like a faculty of a mind or of a property of an entity, whereas choice is, well, more dynamic. It's processive. It's not entitative. And I think when we ask this question about the way the medievals asked the question, I think it's very it misconstrues the nature of what we're talking about because it involves unhelpful reifications. That's all I want to say. Please.
My question, my name is Judith Asfar, and I would just call myself a planetary citizen. And in the context of the planet in peril right now, and the fact that we're all in the same boat, how to work with the differences and somehow use free will to guide us in a more sustainable way. And you know, there's a lot of brain power here, and hopefully people on your kind of caliber can integrate this need that we all have, that's a common need, just to take care of our life support system. And you know, what role has free will played up to now, and what role can it play?
David, you had a Center for the Study of Environmental Decision Making. Do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I couldn't hear much of that question because of the high voice and the acoustics. Could you repeat it?
She was asking how we can harness free will, whatever it is, to solve the plight of the earth now in the environmental situation.
Well, it's hard to give a brief answer to that. I've actually just written an essay on the subject, which is to be published in an Earth Institute book on sustainability. And I hesitate to try to summarize that essay. One of the important aspects is that innovation, which we all seek, we seek improvement, we seek novelty, tends to undercut sustainability, but at the same time, it tends to assume some kind of sustainability or constancy. Our innovations are usually based on assumptions that the society as a whole will be sustainable. Our novelties are based on the notion of subtle violations of accepted rules rather than complete departures from them. And therefore, I think there's a lot of evidence that even people who are determined to innovate the most and are determined the most to see economic growth regardless of the consequences for the planet, do have strong sustainability goals as well as innovation goals, and that these can be harnessed, and that what it takes is awareness of those goals and leadership that makes it seem possible to achieve those goals. goals that seem impossible to achieve, people don't pursue. Once they seem possible and there's leadership, people who've had those goals latently come to the fore. I think the civil rights movement back in the beginning of the 1950s is a very powerful example of the sudden recruitment of many, many more people who had goals of equality and justice because of leadership and because of the realization that those goals were possible to achieve. And I think that the same could be true of sustainability, but we have to pick leaders who will make those goals salient. I don't want to tell anybody how to vote.
I would just comment that it's intriguing, and it's happened several times already at this conference, how the scientific evidence that suggests limitations on free will, and even in the case of some of our speakers, radical skepticism about the possibility of free will, automatically gets put to one side when one asks a question like the one we just heard about policy and law, that the presumption that we can shape our world in positive ways seems rooted in a notion that we are free to choose among various options, which is creating, I think, going forward, a very interesting tension that our society will have to deal with, which is this tension between what appears to be scientific knowledge that calls this into doubt, and yet a very clear, at least at this point still clear, utilitarian value in seeing us as free beings as we've conceptualized ourselves in many traditions, at least for many years. A real challenge for the future.
Could I make just a quick comment on that. I'm finishing the writing of a book that I've been working on for about 5 years on hope. It's a philosophical, theological, political theory study of hope. And one of the points I make early on is the way hope has been constructed in literary accounts such as Dante. In Dante's Inferno, you know, the famous sign over the Inferno that says, "Abandon all hope, you who enter here." There's a theme of hopelessness that runs through the Inferno, and it's very clear that what hopelessness means is the absolute incapacity of human agency. You can no longer make significant choices. You can no longer effectuate anything. That's hopelessness. He gets it from Aquinas. And I think the question is if hope is tied to agency, to the ability to do something effectual and meaningful, what is it rational to hope for, particularly in collective terms as a political society? So no hope without at least the belief in free will, in human agency.
Professor Pollack.
I want to try to bridge what I think my colleagues may have tried to construct as the absence of a bridge by this question to Professor Wallace, but really to everyone on the panel. I don't understand two things you said, one implicitly and one explicitly. And it's not that I disagree, because I don't understand. So I can't say whether you're right or wrong, I just don't understand. The first goes to the notion of the persistence of something after death through reincarnation, and therefore the persistence of something which you affect by your choice of what you do. Absent a creator God and a passage of history, nevertheless, there is change over time in this vision. And that change requires something outside of nature for which I can't imagine the evidence, since the information in a DNA-based organism reduces to zero as the organism's large molecules collapse to small subunits. So how then does reincarnation fit a naturalistic view of the world? And the second, more pointed question is, how may we work together from across this apparent absence of a bridge to deal with the phenomenon, which is not restricted to ourselves, of something happening to someone else whom we care about, whose soul is at stake in a sense. Say, the monotheistic definition of natural evil as opposed to human evil, a sick baby. How does one do something for that sick baby if one is, in fact, entraining oneself not to be concerned about the self? Who cares for the self of that baby under those circumstances?
That would be worth a whole conference. And so I'll try to be very, very concise. I didn't make any explicit references to continuity of consciousness after death or reincarnation in this presentation, because I thought it would really be kind of too much to handle in a context of this sort. But in terms of your question, I think everything hinges on the definition of naturalistic. What exactly is intended, what is meant by that? It's often used as a term almost as if it's self-explanatory. I don't think it is at all. I think what was natural in the 18th century in physics, I mean, lasers blowing up, satellites, that would have been supernatural in the 19th century. So much of 20th century, 21st century physics was unimaginable or supernatural in the 19th century, and likewise for medicine and so forth. So it's a moving target. Is this historically and as a factual statement, the demarcation between natural and supernatural is a moving target, and moreover, it's a target constructed by human beings. It was not given to us by nature or by God. And so I don't, frankly, as I think you've read, since you must have determined whether my last book was published by Columbia University Press, my whole chapter devoted to analyzing. I think you must have read it since you're on that board. It just seems to evaporate, frankly. If by that one simply seems physical or material in a good old 19th century chunky fashion, well, of course, that's been evaporated by 20th century physics, quantum mechanics, even the theory of electromagnetism, of fields traveling through empty space. There's no mechanical explanation for them. They are not material things traveling through space. But in terms of that broad issue of even the possibility of continuity of some form of individual consciousness beyond death, it stands, of course, as a legitimate question. And the way I would approach this would be the way that Galileo approached his understanding of the physical world, and that is through observation. What does the evidence say? Not what is possible given our pre-existing axioms. As we heard about the woman yesterday who refused to come outside during the daytime because she knew the moon couldn't be there, as we've all heard the stories about the medieval scholastics who refused to look through Galileo's telescope because if they were to see something that contradicted their assumptions, it had to be false. That, I think, is the stance of most materialists when it comes to any type of evidence of consciousness beyond the confines of this life. Two areas that are worth looking into, and one is very clearly scientifically rigorous, and that is near-death experiences, alleged post-death experiences. There's some very good research going on in this area. I heard an excellent presentation by Bruce Grayson from the University of Virginia. I've just heard of a Dutch researcher in this area also doing very good work. And so that's an area just looking for the empirical evidence, these so-called out-of-body experiences, for which I want to maintain a neutral stance and just see how compelling the evidence are themselves. Treat it like any other natural phenomenon. If there are actual out-of-body experiences, then that would imply there's a dimension of consciousness that is not contingent upon brain function. That's one area. Another area that's been researched, I think, quite meticulously, and I think quite with an open mind for more 40 years by now, by Ian Stevenson and his protégés at University of Virginia, is children who allegedly have past life recall and accurately recall events in somebody else's life for whom they had no feasible access in this lifetime, and coming up with detailed memories. Again, just to approach that with an open mind, saying, I have no idea how it could be the case, but is it the case? That's the way I would want to approach it, dynamically rather than ontologically. Looking at the phenomena first and then looking for justification second, rather than saying there's no justification, therefore the empirical data can't be there. And that is a stance taken all too often, I think, by the cognitive scientific community. I won't look because I know it's impossible. Exactly the mindset of the woman who refused to step out the door to see whether the moon shone in the daytime. So it's a large issue. The second point here is, and I have to be very brief, but it's hard because you've raised such enormous issues. When Buddhism refutes the existence as Professor Mittleman correctly said, of a reified self, of an ontologically self-existent entity of a soul or a self. This does not at all refute the existence of the self altogether, right? But rather the self on a relative or conventional level is understood as an ongoing dynamic process in interrelationship with the mind and body, in interrelationship with the environment, co-emerging, arising from moment to moment, and with respect to multiple cognitive frames of reference. You arising to me right now, very different from how you arose to somebody this morning, perhaps your wife. I can't recall whether you're married. But you're arising from moment to moment. So the notion of the self is taken very seriously. We do exist. There's someone listening, someone speaking, but simply we refuse to reify it. So for the child who is sick, we treat with all compassion, and in fact it said the deeper the insight into the absence of a reified self, the greater empathy arises. The greater grounds for loving kindness and compassion arises because reified selves are absolutely independent and unrelated, which then undermines any true empathy. The notion of selves being relational actually provides a foundation for deeper empathy and caring for others. A very inadequate question for a response to two very deep questions.
Well, we are, did you have, David? Go ahead.
Well, just a very brief comment from one of the closed-minded cognitive scientists. I've tried to keep an open mind for a long time, and it's made very difficult for me by the fact that the people who produce the evidence always seem to be true believers who are prepared to find evidence for what they believe and not prepared to find anything else. And this isn't only true in this area. One sees it in medicine and medical research all the time, which is why carefully blinded clinical trials have become a gold standard. So I would have an open mind for evidence that's brought to me by highly skeptical or open-minded people. It's much harder to do it when you feel that it's probably fraudulent.
I heartily agree with that. But for such research to take place, it needs to be funded. And if the powers be make sure that no funding goes in that direction, then they're acting out of their own bias to prevent good science from taking place. So where there's bad science, let there be better science, rather than no science at all.
Okay, well, we started 7 minutes late this morning, and we've now run 7 minutes over at the end here. So you've gotten every second of this panel that you signed up for. This is our lunch break. We come back at 2 this afternoon to have our final afternoon sessions, and we look forward to seeing you then. Please join me in thanking our panel for their presentations.